The wooden pews of Black Hollow's only church creaked under the weight of too many bodies packed too close together. It wasn't often the town gathered for a wedding, and it was even rare when that wedding felt more like a funeral. Clara stood in the vestibule, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the bouquet of dried wildflowers until her knuckles went white. Through the cracked door, she could see them all. Miners still wearing dirt under their fingernails, saloon girls in their brightest dresses, merchants who'd extended credit to her father one too many times, and women whose eyes held more pity than Clara could stand. "You don't have to do this," whispered Martha Henley, the seamstress who'd helped alter her mother's old wedding dress that morning. The fabric hung loose in places where Clara's frame couldn't fill it. Her mother had been softer, rounder, fed by a husband who'd loved her before the cards and whiskey took him completely. Clara's throat felt lined with sand. "Yes, I do." "There's other ways, child. You could—" "Could what?" Clara's voice came out sharper than intended. "Run? With what money? Hide? Where? My father owes half this town and Silas Crow owns the rest." She closed her eyes. "At least this way the debt dies with the marriage." Martha's silence said everything. They both knew the truth. In the frontier territories of 1867, a woman without family, money, or prospects had exactly two choices: marry whoever would have her, or end up in a crib behind the Lucky Strike saloon servicing miners for $2 a turn. Clara had seen what happened to girls who went that route. She'd rather marry the devil himself. The problem was, she might be doing exactly that. The door swung open, and her father stumbled through. Thomas Whitmore had been handsome once, or so her mother's old photographs suggested. Now he was 47 and looked 60, his face mapped with broken blood vessels and his hands shaking from last night's whiskey. He wore his only suit, the one they'd buried Clara's mother in before Clara insisted they retrieve it from the casket. They couldn't afford to bury good wool. "Time to go, girl." His breath reeked of the hair of the dog he'd downed that morning. Clara wanted to spit in his face. She wanted to scream at him for every card game, every bottle, every promise he'd broken since Mama died 3 years ago. Instead, she lifted her chin and took his offered arm because that's what women did. They swallowed their rage and smiled and pretended the men who ruined them were worth their obedience. The church doors opened, and every head turned. The walk down that aisle felt longer than the 20 years Clara had been alive. She could feel their stares like hands pawing at her dress. Poor thing. 20 years old and being sold like livestock. Wonder if she'll survive the winter up in those mountains. Heard he hasn't been with a woman in 5 years. Heard he's more animal than man now. The whispers followed her like a cold draft. And then she saw him. Gideon Vale stood at the altar beside Reverend Michaels, and Clara's breath caught somewhere between her throat and her chest. She'd seen him once before, 3 weeks ago, when he'd ridden into town to speak with her father. She'd watched from the upstairs window as they'd talked in the street, her father's desperate gestures contrasting with Gideon's absolute stillness. Even from a distance, she'd felt the weight of him. Not his size, though he was tall and broad-shouldered, but something else. A presence that made the air around him feel heavier. Up close, he was worse. The left side of his face bore a scar that ran from temple to jaw, the kind of wound that should have killed him. His beard was trimmed close, but couldn't hide it. His hair, dark as wet coal, was pulled back and tied with leather cord. He wore black trousers, black vest, black coat, like he was attending a funeral instead of a wedding. Maybe he was. His eyes, pale gray and unsettling, tracked her approach with an intensity that made Clara's stomach clench. He looked like exactly what the stories claimed, a killer who'd learned to walk upright. Her father deposited her at the altar like a package he was relieved to be rid of and stumbled back to his pew. Reverend Michaels cleared his throat nervously. He was sweating despite the cold, and his hands shook slightly as he opened his Bible. Even the preacher was afraid. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice cracking, "we are gathered here today, Ma." "Make it quick," Gideon said. His voice was low, rough from disuse, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. Reverend Michaels flinched. "Of course. Do you, Gideon Vale, take this woman?" "I do." "And do you, Clara Whitmore?" "She does," Gideon said, his eyes never leaving the Reverend's face. "Finish it." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She should speak up. She should say something, but her voice had abandoned her completely. bled somewhere deep inside where the little girl who'd once believed in fairy tales was sobbing in a corner. By the power vested in me by the territory and... The Reverend was practically babbling now. I pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss... Gideon moved so quickly that Clara gasped. For one terrible moment, she thought he was going to grab her, claim her like property in front of everyone. Instead, he stepped close, and she caught the scent of pine smoke and leather. He reached up, and Clara's whole body went rigid. His calloused hand cupped her cheek with unexpected gentleness. Then he bent down and pressed his lips to her forehead, so softly it barely qualified as contact. The kiss lasted less than a second. When he pulled back, something flickered in those pale gray eyes. Regret, maybe, or apology. Then it was gone, shuttered behind that blank expression he wore like armor. It's done, he said. The church remained silent. Someone coughed. A woman in the back row was crying, though whether from relief or sorrow Clara couldn't tell. Gideon took Clara's elbow, not roughly but firmly enough to guide her, and led her back down the aisle. She moved mechanically, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. That kiss, that gentle, almost reverent kiss on her forehead. It didn't match the stories. It didn't match the scar on his face or the reputation that preceded him. Outside, the November sky hung low and gray, promising snow. A horse was tied to the hitching post. Not the wild-eyed beast she'd expected, but a sturdy bay mare with kind eyes. Beside it stood a small wagon loaded with supplies. "Can you ride?" Gideon asked. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good. It's 3 hours to the cabin. Storm's coming tonight, and I want to be home before it hits." He paused, and for the first time he looked directly at her. Really looked at her. "You have anything you need to collect? Any belongings?" Claire's voice came out as a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I have a trunk. At the boarding house." "Where?" "Mrs. Patterson's. 2 streets over." Gideon nodded once and swung himself onto the wagon seat. He offered her his hand. Clara stared at it. Broad palm, scarred knuckles, dirt under the nails from honest work. After a moment, she took it. His grip was strong but careful as he helped her up beside him. The town watched them roll away. Clara could feel their eyes burning into her back, but she didn't turn around. She kept her gaze forward, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight. If this was the last time Black Hollow saw her, she'd be damned if she gave them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Mrs. Patterson had Clara's trunk ready and waiting on the porch, as if she couldn't wait to be rid of the girl who'd been 3 weeks behind on rent. Gideon loaded it into the wagon without comment. Clara noticed he handled it carefully, not throwing it around despite its weight. They left Black Hollow behind without ceremony. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. The wagon rolled along a dirt road that gradually narrowed into a trail, civilization falling away with each turn of the wheels. The forest pressed in close on both sides, towering pines and bare aspens, their branches reaching across the path like fingers trying to knit together overhead. The temperature dropped as they climbed higher into the foothills. Clara stole glances at her husband from the corner of her eye. He sat relaxed but alert, his hands loose on the reins, his attention on the trail ahead. Up close, she could see more details. The small scar on his right eyebrow, the way his jaw was set like he was perpetually braced for bad news, the slight weathering around his eyes that suggested he squinted into the sun often. He looked to be in his early 30s, though it was hard to tell. Hard-living aged people fast out here. "You're staring," he said without looking at her. Clara jerked her gaze forward, her cheeks burning. "I'm sorry. Don't apologize. You have a right to look at what you bought." "I didn't buy anything. My father..." "Your father sold you to pay his debts." Gideon's voice held no judgment, just flat statement of fact. "That means you bought your way out of whatever he owed using the only currency you had, your freedom. So yes, you bought something. You bought survival, even if the price was higher than it should have been." Clara's throat tightened. "That's a cruel way to put it." "It's an honest way to put it." He finally glanced at her, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I don't deal in pretty lies, Mrs. Vale. If we're going to live together, you should know that now." Mrs. Vale. The name felt foreign, like a coat that didn't fit right. Clara pulled her mother's shawl tighter around her shoulders. "What should I call you?" Gideon's fine. Or Vale, if you prefer. Don't much care. And you'll call me Clara? Unless you object. No, I... She trailed off, unsure what she'd been about to say. Gideon's fine. They lapsed back into silence, but it felt different now. Less oppressive. The trail grew steeper and the mare leaned into the climb with steady determination. Around them, the forest thickened. Clara had lived her whole life in Black Hollow, but she'd never ventured this deep into the mountains. Most people didn't. The mountains were where outlaws hid, where prospectors went crazy from isolation, where women disappeared. Are you going to hurt me? The question escaped before she could stop it. Gideon's hands tightened on the reins for just a moment. No. The stories say a lot of things. His voice had gone cold again, but Clara sensed the coldness wasn't directed at her. Most of them aren't true. Some of them are. But none of them include me raising a hand to a woman who never did me wrong. Then why did you agree to this? To marrying me? Clara twisted her hands in her lap. My father said you paid his debts in full. That's nearly $800. Why would you do that for a stranger? For a long moment, Gideon didn't answer. The only sounds were the wagon wheels crunching over rocks and the mare's steady breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. I had my reasons. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting today. He glanced at the sky, which had darkened to pewter. Storm's moving faster than I thought. We need to make better time. He snapped the reins and the mare picked up her pace. Clara gripped the edge of the wagon seat as they jolted over rougher terrain. Questions burned on her tongue, but she swallowed them. Whatever Gideon Vale's reasons were, he clearly wasn't ready to share them. And honestly, what did it matter? She was bound to him now, for better or worse, and the law wouldn't help her even if she wanted to run. The first snowflakes began to fall as they rounded a sharp bend in the trail. Within minutes, the air was thick with them, fat white flakes that stuck to Clara's eyelashes and melted on her cheeks. The temperature plummeted. She pulled the shawl up over her head, but it did little to block the wind that cut through her thin dress. Without a word, Gideon shrugged out of his coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy and warm, carrying his scent of smoke and pine. Clara started to protest, but he cut her off. Take it. I've got a sweater under this vest. You're shaking so hard you're going to rattle the wagon apart. It was true. She was shaking. Though whether from cold or fear or delayed shock, she couldn't say. Clara pulled the coat tight around her and mumbled her thanks. They pushed on through the snow. The trail became harder to follow, but Gideon seemed to navigate by instinct, guiding the mare around obstacles Clara couldn't even see. The world shrank to a small bubble of visibility around them. Everything beyond that a curtain of white. Time lost meaning. It could have been 30 minutes or 3 hours when Gideon finally spoke again. There. Through those trees. Clara squinted through the snow and saw it. A cabin tucked into a small clearing backed up against a steep rocky slope. It was larger than she'd expected, built from solid logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Smoke rose from the chimney, which meant Gideon had left a fire banked before riding to town. A small barn stood off to one side, just big enough for the horse and wagon. Relief flooded through her. They'd made it. She was freezing, exhausted, and married to a stranger, but at least she wouldn't freeze to death on a mountain trail tonight. Gideon drove the wagon directly to the barn, and Clara helped him unhitch the mare despite her numb fingers. He worked quickly and efficiently, rubbing the horse down and making sure she had water and feed. Clara noticed the way he spoke softly to the animal, almost affectionately. It was the gentlest she'd heard his voice. Get inside, he told Clara. Door's unlocked. I'll bring your trunk in after I finish here. Clara didn't argue. She fought her way through snow that was already ankle-deep, climbed the porch steps, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The warmth hit her like a wall. The cabin's interior was a single large room with a loft accessible by a ladder. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across rough-hewn furniture. A table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the fire, shelves lined with supplies and books. Books. And in the far corner, a bed covered with thick quilts. One bed. Clara's breath caught. Of course there was one bed. They were married. He was her husband. This was her wedding night. The door opened behind her and Gideon entered carrying her trunk like it weighed nothing. He set it down near the bed and then stood there, snow melting in his hair, watching her with those unsettling gray eyes. "You're scared," he observed. Clara lifted her chin. "Wouldn't you be?" "Probably." He moved to the fire and added another log. "The bed's yours tonight. I'll sleep in the loft." "That's not—" Clara stopped, confused. "This is your home, and you're my wife. That makes it your home, too." Gideon straightened, brushing bark from his hands. "I'm not going to touch you, Clara. Not tonight. Not until you want me to, if that day ever comes. I know what people say about me, and I know you agreed to this marriage because you had no choice. I'm not going to punish you for your father's failures." The kindness in his words hit harder than cruelty would have. Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. She'd cried enough over the past 3 weeks. She was done crying. "Thank you," she whispered. Gideon nodded once and moved toward the ladder. "There's food in the larder if you're hungry, coffee on the stove. Make yourself comfortable. We'll talk more in the morning." He climbed to the loft with practiced ease and disappeared from view. Clara heard the creak of wood as he settled in, and then silence. She stood alone in the center of her new home, still wearing her dead mother's dress and a stranger's coat, and let herself breathe for what felt like the first time in hours. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside, snow piled against the windows. And Clara Whitmore, Clara Vale now, realized she'd survived her wedding day. Whether she'd survive what came next remained to be seen. She didn't sleep that first night. How could she? Every sound made her flinch, the settling of the cabin, the pop of the fire, the wind screaming through the trees outside. She lay rigid in that big bed, still fully clothed, staring at the ceiling beams and listening for footsteps on the ladder. They never came. Gideon stayed in the loft, and eventually Clara heard the deep, even breathing of someone who slept without guilt or fear. She envied him that. When dawn finally crept through the windows, gray and cold, Clara dragged herself out of bed. Her back ached from tension, and her head throbbed from lack of sleep. She found the water barrel near the door, splashed her face, and tried to make sense of the cabin in daylight. It was surprisingly well kept. No dirty dishes piled in the basin, no clothes thrown in corners, no whiskey bottles rolling under furniture like there'd been at home. Everything had its place. The books on the shelves were worn but carefully arranged. Technical manuals on tracking and survival, a few works of fiction, a Bible that looked untouched. The larder held salt pork, beans, flour, coffee, dried fruit. Enough to last through winter. The loft ladder creaked, and Clara spun around. Gideon descended slowly, his hair loose around his shoulders now. In the morning light, he looked less like a demon and more like a man who hadn't slept much better than she had. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Coffee?" she offered, trying to sound like a proper wife instead of a terrified girl. "Please." Clara's hands shook slightly as she poured from the pot on the stove. She handed him the cup, and their fingers brushed. He had warm hands. She hadn't expected that. Gideon took a long drink, his eyes closing briefly. "Thank you." They stood in awkward silence. Clara had no idea what wives did on the morning after their wedding. She'd never had a mother to teach her these things. Mama had died when Clara was 17, before she'd had a chance to explain anything beyond the most basic facts of marriage. And those facts currently had Clara's stomach in knots. "I should explain things," Gideon said finally. He set his coffee down and leaned against the table. "About why you're here." "You paid my father's debts. That's why I'm here." "That's what I did. Not why I did it." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that made him look younger, almost uncertain. 3 weeks ago, I heard something in town that made me ride down from this mountain for the first time in 2 years. Clara's pulse quickened. "What did you hear?" "That Silas Crow had bought up your father's gambling markers. All of them. And that he was planning to call them due." The name hit Clara like a fist to the stomach. Silas Crow. Everyone in Black Hollow knew that name, and everyone with sense feared it. He owned the largest ranch in the territory, controlled most of the mining claims, and had judges and sheriffs in his pocket. He was 55 years old, cruel, and had buried 2 wives already under suspicious circumstances. What does Silas Crow have to do with me? But even as Clara asked, part of her already knew. "He wanted you." Gideon's voice went flat and hard. "Your father owed him money. A lot of money. Crow was going to offer him a deal. Forgive the debt entirely in exchange for you. A contract marriage, all legal and binding. Your father would have taken it. He was that desperate. Clara's legs went weak. She sat down hard in one of the chairs. How do you know this? Because Crow's done it before. 3 times that I know of. He finds men buried in debt, men with daughters, and he makes them an offer. The law doesn't care as long as there's a marriage certificate. Gideon's jaw clenched. His last wife died 6 months ago. Fell down the stairs, they said. Just like the one before her had a riding accident. Just like his first wife drowned in the creek behind his house. Horror crawled up Clara's spine. And you stopped him by marrying me first? I bought your father's debt from every creditor in town before Crow could consolidate it all. Cost me everything I'd saved over 5 years of tracking bounties and guiding hunting parties. Then I went to your father and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. I'd forgive the entire debt in exchange for permission to marry you. He agreed before I'd finished talking. Clara's mind reeled. But why? Why would you spend everything you have to save a stranger from Silas Crow? Gideon was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Clara's chest ache. Because 12 years ago, Silas Crow murdered my younger brother, and I've been waiting 12 years for a chance to destroy him without becoming the monster he tried to make me. The cabin fell silent except for the crack and pop of the fire. Your brother, Clara whispered. Daniel. He was 19, working as a deputy in Silver Creek. Crow was running an illegal mining operation on federal land, and Daniel found out about it. He was going to testify. Gideon's hands curled into fists. They found Daniel in a ravine with a bullet in his back. Everyone knew Crow was responsible, but he had 3 men willing to swear he was playing poker in town when it happened. Case closed. Justice denied. And you couldn't prove otherwise. I tried. For 2 years I tried. I followed every lead, hunted down every witness, nearly got myself killed 6 times. His voice roughened. Finally realized I was going about it wrong. Crow had the law in his pocket. Going after him directly would just get me hanged for murder, and then Daniel's death would mean nothing. Clara's throat felt tight. So you've been waiting. For what? For him to make a mistake. For an opportunity to hit him in a way he couldn't defend against. Gideon met her eyes, and Clara saw something raw in his expression. When I heard he was targeting you, I saw my chance. In the territory law, a woman's debts transfer to her husband when she marries. By marrying you before Crow could, I legally absorbed your father's obligations and removed you from his reach entirely. He can't touch you now without committing a crime against my property, which would finally give the law grounds to investigate him properly. I'm your property? The words tasted bitter. In the eyes of the law, yes. In reality, Gideon's expression softened slightly. You're a person who deserved better than to be traded like livestock. I couldn't save Daniel, but I could save you. And maybe, just maybe, it'll be enough to force Crow into doing something stupid that finally brings him down. Clara sat back, trying to process everything. She'd gone from being sold to pay debts, to being saved from a murderous rancher, to being part of a 12-year revenge plot. Her head spun. So our marriage, she said slowly, is just a legal maneuver. A way to get at Silas Crow? It's a legal marriage, valid and binding, but yes, it's strategic. Gideon's voice gentled. I'm sorry you got caught in the middle of this. If I could have found another way, I would have, but I couldn't let him take you. Because you're a good man? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Don't make that mistake. I'm not good. I'm just less terrible than Crow. You gave me your bed. You promised not to touch me. You spent your life savings to save a stranger. Clara's voice strengthened. That sounds fairly good to me. I've killed men, Clara. More than I can count. Some of them probably deserved it, but not all of them. I've done things that would make you sick if you knew the details. He looked away. Don't confuse tactical kindness with virtue. But Clara had spent 3 years living with a man who'd sacrificed his daughter for cards and whiskey. She'd watched him spiral into selfishness, seen him choose his own comfort over her safety time and time again. Whatever Gideon Vale was, he wasn't that. He'd spent everything he had to protect someone he didn't know. That had to count for something. What happens now, she asked. Now we wait. Crow will know by tomorrow that you're married. He'll be furious, but he can't do anything openly without admitting what he was planning. He'll probably watch us for a while, look for weaknesses. We need to be careful. Will he come here? Eventually, but not until he has a plan. Gideon straightened. In the meantime, we have a winter to survive. This cabin's isolated, and the snow will close us in completely within a few weeks. We need to lay in more firewood, check the food stores, make sure the barn won't collapse under snow weight. The practicality of it helped ground Clara. She could handle work. Work made sense. What do you need me to do? Gideon studied her for a moment, and something like respect flickered in his eyes. Can you cook? Yes. So? Well enough. Then you handle the domestic work. I'll handle everything outside. We split the chores down the middle, otherwise. He paused. This isn't a traditional marriage, Clara. I'm not going to order you around or treat you like a servant. We're partners in survival. Understood? Clara nodded slowly. Partners. It was more than her father had ever offered. More than Silas Crow would have given her. She could work with partners. Understood. Good. Gideon grabbed his coat from its peg near the door. I'm going to check the barn and cut wood. You do whatever you need to make this place feel like home. Your trunk has your things in it, and there's space in the loft if you want privacy. He left, and Clara was alone again. She sat for a long time, staring at the fire, trying to reconcile the man who'd just left with the monster she'd imagined during the wedding. Nothing fit together properly. Gideon Vale was supposed to be a brutal killer, a man who'd vanished into the mountains like a wild animal. Instead, he was offering her partnership and privacy, giving her his bed, explaining his actions instead of demanding her obedience. Maybe the stories had been wrong about him. Or maybe, and this thought scared her more, maybe people were more complicated than stories allowed them to be. Clara stood and went to her trunk. Time to unpack her life and figure out what kind of woman she needed to become to survive in this strange new world. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere down in the valley, Silas Crow was learning that his carefully laid plans had been destroyed by a ghost from his past. The game had changed, and Clara was now a piece on the board, whether she wanted to be or not. The first week passed in a strange rhythm that felt nothing like Clara had imagined married life would be. She woke each morning to find Gideon already gone, out checking traps or chopping wood or doing whatever mysterious work mountain men did before dawn. He'd leave the fire built up and coffee on the stove, small gestures that felt more considerate than anything her father had done in years. She'd spend her days cleaning a cabin that was already clean, mending clothes that barely needed mending, and trying not to think too hard about the fact that she was living alone with a man who still felt like a stranger. They ate meals together in near silence. Gideon wasn't much for conversation, and Clara didn't know what to say to him. What did you talk about with a husband you'd married to escape a worse fate? The weather felt too trivial. Her past felt too painful. His motivations felt too dangerous to probe. So they ate in quiet, the scrape of forks on tin plates the only sound besides the wind outside. But on the 8th day, something shifted. Clara was kneading bread dough when Gideon came in from the cold, his arms loaded with firewood. He stacked it by the hearth, then stood there rubbing his hands together, his breath still misting in the cabin's warmth. "Storm's coming," he said. "Big one. We'll be snowed in for days, maybe a week." Clara's hands stilled in the dough. "How can you tell?" "Animals are hiding. Sky's got that yellow cast to it, and my leg's aching like hell." He said it matter-of-factly, no self-pity in his tone. "Your leg?" "Broke it badly 7 years ago. Healed crooked. Acts up before storms." Gideon moved to the stove and poured himself coffee. "We need to bring more supplies in from the barn before it hits. Food for the horse, extra lamp oil, that sort of thing." "I can help." He glanced at her, surprised. "You don't have to. I said we're partners, didn't I?" Clara covered the dough with a cloth and wiped her hands on her apron. "Besides, I'm going stir-crazy in here. I need to do something useful." The corner of Gideon's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "All right then. Put on something warm." They worked together for the next 2 hours, hauling supplies from the barn to the cabin. Clara discovered that Gideon had stored an impressive amount of provisions: sacks of beans and flour, preserved vegetables in jars, smoked meat hanging from the rafters, even a few luxuries like sugar and tea. He'd been preparing for winter long before he'd ridden down to Black Hollow to marry her. "Did you know you'd be bringing someone back here?" Clara asked as they stacked jars in the larder. "When you laid all this in?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I knew Crow was circling your family. I'd been watching for 6 months, waiting to see how he'd make his move. So yes, I planned for the possibility." 6 months. Claire sat back on her heels. "You've been watching me for 6 months?" "Not you specifically, your father, but yeah, I saw you around town." He didn't look at her, focusing on arranging the jars instead. "You worked at the boarding house sometimes. Helped Mrs. Patterson with the laundry." Clara felt oddly exposed knowing he'd observed her without her knowledge. "What else did you notice?" "That you walked with your head down, that you flinched when men got too close, that you looked tired all the time, like you were carrying something heavy that nobody else could see." His voice gentled. "That you deserved better than what you were getting." The honesty of it hit Clara in the chest. She'd spent so long trying to be invisible in Black Hollow, hoping that if she was quiet enough and small enough, the world would stop hurting her. It had never occurred to her that someone might actually see her, really see her, and think she mattered. "Thank you," she whispered. Gideon finally looked at her. "For what?" "For seeing me." He held her gaze for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Then he turned back to the jars. "Come on. We've got more work to do before that storm hits." By late afternoon, the first flakes had started falling. By evening, the world outside had disappeared into a wall of white. The wind howled around the cabin like something alive and angry, rattling the shutters and screaming down the chimney. Clara had never heard wind like that in town. Black Hollow sat in a protected valley, sheltered from the worst of the mountain weather. Up here, there was nothing to stop the storm's fury. "It'll blow itself out in a day or two," Gideon said, seemingly unbothered. He sat in the rocking chair near the fire, cleaning his rifle with practiced efficiency. "We're safe enough here. Cabins stood for 15 years through worse than this." Clara sat at the table trying to focus on the shirt she was mending, but her hands kept shaking. Every shriek of the wind made her jump. She'd never felt so isolated in her life, so cut off from everything familiar. If something happened to them up here, no one would know. No one would come. "You're afraid of storms," Gideon observed. "I'm afraid of being trapped," Clara corrected. "There's a difference." "Fair enough." He set the rifle aside and leaned back. "Want to know something that might help?" "What?" "This cabin has 3 exits, the front door, the back window in the loft, and a root cellar under the floorboards with a tunnel that comes out 50 feet into the woods. If you ever feel trapped, remember you're not. There's always a way out." Clara stared at him. "You built escape routes into your own home. Learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you can do is back yourself into a corner with no options." He picked up the rifle again. "This place might look like a trap, but it's actually a fortress. Nobody can sneak up on us here, and if they try, we've got plenty of ways to disappear." The practicality of it made Clara feel marginally better. Gideon wasn't just some wild man who'd fled civilization. He was strategic, careful. Everything he did had a reason behind it. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked. 5 years, give or take. Built most of the cabin myself, though I had help with the heavy timber work." "Don't you get lonely?" Gideon's hand stilled on the rifle. "Sometimes, but lonely's better than dead, and that's what I'd be if I stayed in town after what I tried to do to Crow." He resumed cleaning. "Besides, the mountains have their own company. Animals, weather, the work of staying alive. Keeps you busy enough that you don't have much time to feel sorry for yourself." Clara thought about her own loneliness in Black Hollow, surrounded by people who'd watched her father destroy himself and done nothing to help. She'd been lonely in a crowded town. Maybe isolation and loneliness weren't the same thing. "Tell me about Daniel," she said suddenly. Gideon's jaw tightened. "Why?" "Because he's part of why I'm here, and because I want to understand." For a long moment she thought he'd refuse. Then he set the rifle down and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Daniel was 5 years younger than me. Should have been 10 years smarter. He had this—" Gideon struggled for words. "This belief that the world could be fair if people just tried hard enough to make it that way. Drove me crazy when we were kids. I'd tell him the world was brutal and you had to be brutal back to survive, and he'd argue that being brutal just made more brutality. Said someone had to be the first one to choose different." Clara heard the pain underneath the words. He sounds like he was a good person. He was better than good. He was decent, which is rarer. Gideon's voice roughened. When he got that deputy job, I told him to keep his head down. Don't make waves. Don't go looking for trouble. Just do the minimum and collect your pay. But that wasn't Danny. He saw wrong, and he couldn't just ignore it. So when he found out Crow was running an illegal operation and using that money to bribe officials, Danny gathered evidence, built a whole case, was going to take it to the federal marshal. And Crow found out. Crow always finds out. He's got people everywhere. Gideon's hands curled into fists. They found Danny's body at the bottom of Sawmill Ravine. Official reports said he'd fallen while tracking a suspect, but Danny had a bullet in his spine, and his horse was stabled in town that day. He didn't fall. He was murdered and dumped like trash. Clara's throat ached. I'm sorry. Being sorry doesn't bring him back. Doesn't fix what I lost. Gideon looked at her, and Clara saw raw grief in his eyes. Danny was the only family I had left. Our parents died when we were young. Cholera took Ma, and Pa drank himself to death 2 years later. It was just us against the world. I was supposed to protect him. That was my job. And I failed. It wasn't your fault that Crow... I should have stopped him from taking that deputy job. Should have made him leave the territory entirely. Should have done something other than let my baby brother walk into a situation I knew was dangerous. His voice cracked slightly. So yeah, Clara. I see a young woman being circled by the same predator who killed Danny, and I do whatever it takes to stop him. Because I couldn't save my brother, but maybe I can stop Crow from taking anyone else. The cabin fell silent except for the storm's rage outside. Clara understood now. She wasn't just a legal maneuver in Gideon's revenge plot. She was his second chance, his way of balancing the scales for a loss he'd never gotten over. I'm not your redemption, she said quietly. You know that, right? Gideon met her eyes. I know, but you're alive and safe, and that's more than Danny got. It's not redemption, it's just less failure. The bleakness in his voice made Clara want to cross the room and touch him, offer some comfort for pain that ran bone deep. But they were still strangers in most ways, bound by law but not by trust, and she didn't know if her comfort would be welcome or just another burden. Instead, she said, Tell me something good about him, about Daniel. Not about how he died, but how he lived. Gideon blinked, surprised. What? You said he believed the world could be fair. That must have come from somewhere. Tell me a story that shows me who he was. For a moment, Gideon just stared at her. Then something in his expression softened, the hard edges smoothing just slightly. All right, he said. There was this one time. He talked for over an hour, and Clara listened as the storm raged and the fire burned low. He told her about Daniel teaching himself to read from newspapers left in the saloon, about Daniel giving his winter coat to a prospector's widow and spending 3 months freezing because he was too proud to ask for charity, about Daniel breaking up a fight between two drunks by playing his harmonica until they were too confused to keep swinging. Small stories, human stories, the kind that painted a picture of a person who'd tried to be decent in a world that punished decency. And as Gideon talked, Clara realized something. He wasn't just grieving his brother. He was grieving the loss of hope that Daniel had represented. Danny had believed in fairness, in justice, in the possibility of good winning out. And when he died, that belief had died with him, leaving Gideon alone with nothing but rage and survivor's guilt. He would have liked you, Gideon said finally, his voice tired. Danny always said the measure of a person was how they treated folks who couldn't do anything for them in return. You're kind even when there's no benefit to it. He'd have respected that. Clara's eyes stung with unexpected tears. I wish I could have known him. Yeah, me too. They sat in comfortable silence after that, the stories hanging in the air between them like a bridge slowly being built. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the cabin felt warmer somehow, less like a prison and more like a shelter. Two damaged people, bound together by circumstance and shared loss, learning to exist in the same space without causing each other more harm. It wasn't love, it wasn't even friendship yet, but it was something, some small seed of connection that might grow into trust if they were both careful enough to nurture it. The storm lasted 3 days, just as Gideon had predicted. 3 days of howling wind and blinding snow, 3 days trapped inside with nothing to do but work on small tasks and learn to be comfortable in each other's presence. Clara cooked meals that Gideon praised with genuine appreciation. Gideon taught her how to identify animal tracks in the snow by drawing them on paper. They played cards in the evening. Nothing with stakes, just games to pass the time. Clara learned that Gideon had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed, and Gideon discovered that Clara could curse like a sailor when she got a bad hand. "Where'd you learn to swear like that?" he asked after she creatively insulted the deck. Clara felt her cheeks heat. "The miners at the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson would have washed my mouth with soap if she'd heard me." "Well, Mrs. Patterson's not here." Gideon shuffled the cards. "Feel free to swear all you want. I've heard worse." It was a small permission, but it mattered. Clara had spent her whole life being told to be quieter, smaller, more proper. Having someone tell her she could be loud and crude if she wanted felt strangely liberating. On the fourth morning, Clara woke to silence. Not the muffled quiet of falling snow, but real silence. The storm had passed. She climbed out of bed and opened the shutters, and her breath caught. The world outside was transformed. Snow lay thick and pristine, covering everything in white so bright it hurt to look at. The trees drooped under the weight, their branches forming delicate archways. The sky was a blue so clear and perfect it looked painted. Everything sparkled in the sunlight like diamonds scattered across the landscape. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Gideon's voice came from behind her, and Clara turned to find him descending from the loft. His hair was loose around his shoulders, and he looked more relaxed than she'd seen him. "It's stunning," she breathed. "I've never seen anything like it." Mountains after a storm or something special. All that fury and violence, and then this. He moved to stand beside her at the window. Makes you believe the world might have some grace in it after all. They stood there together, watching the sunrise paint the snow gold and pink, and Clara felt something shift inside her chest. She'd been so focused on survival, on getting through each day, that she'd forgotten to look for beauty. But it was here, even in this isolated place, maybe especially here. "Gideon?" she said quietly. "Yeah?" "Thank you for bringing me here." He glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face. "You're thanking me for kidnapping you into the mountains?" "You didn't kidnap me. You saved me." Clara met his eyes. "I know this isn't a real marriage, not in the way most people mean it, but it's real enough that I'm safe and fed and not sold to Silas Crow. That's more than I had 2 weeks ago." Gideon's expression went soft in a way that made him look younger, less hardened. "You're welcome." They stood there in the morning light, two people learning to be grateful for small mercies, and Clara thought that maybe this strange arrangement might actually work. They were finding a rhythm, building something that looked almost like partnership. It wasn't what she'd dreamed of as a girl, but dreams were luxuries for people who had choices. She'd take functional reality over broken dreams any day. The peace lasted exactly 6 more days. Clara was in the barn feeding the horse when she heard it. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, coming up the trail. Her heart kicked against her ribs. They never had visitors. The cabin was too remote, the trail too difficult. Anyone coming here was coming with purpose. She ran to the cabin. "Gideon!" He was already at the window, rifle in hand, his body tense. "I heard. Get in the loft and stay quiet." "What's happening?" "Just do it, Clara. Now." The command in his voice got her moving. She climbed the ladder fast and pressed herself against the loft wall where she could see down into the cabin but wouldn't be immediately visible. Her heart hammered so loud she was sure it would give her away. The hoofbeats stopped outside. Clara heard men's voices, rough and aggressive. Then someone pounded on the door hard enough to rattle it in its frame. "Vale, we know you're in there!" Gideon stood perfectly still, the rifle held loosely but ready. "State your business. Open this door or we'll break it down. You're on my property without permission. The law says I can shoot you for trespassing." Gideon's voice was flat, emotionless. "Give me a good reason not to." There was muttering outside, then a different voice spoke. Smoother, older, with the kind of authority that came from money and power. "Mr. Vale, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to talk." Clara's blood ran cold. She knew that voice from town, from the times he'd visited the boarding house and left generous tips that felt more like down payments than courtesy. Silas Crow. Gideon's jaw clenched, but his voice stayed level. "We've got nothing to talk about, Crow." "I think we do. You married a girl who was promised to me." Clara Whitmore was promised to no one. I checked every contract, every deed, every legal document. You had no claim on her. Her father owed me money. That's claim enough. Her father owed you money. Her father. Not her. And now those debts are paid. Gideon shifted his grip on the rifle. She's my wife, legal and bound. The territory law is clear on this. You've got no grounds to challenge it. Silence outside. Then Crow's voice came again, colder now. May I at least see the girl? Confirm she's here of her own free will and not being held against her wishes? Clara's stomach dropped. She knew what Crow was doing, trying to manufacture a reason to claim she was kidnapped, coerced, in danger. If she showed herself looking scared or unwilling, he'd have grounds to involve the law. But if she didn't show herself at all, he'd claim Gideon was hiding something. She made a decision. Before Gideon could stop her, she climbed down from the loft and walked to stand beside her husband. His eyes flashed with anger and fear, but she ignored it and called out clearly, I'm here, Mr. Crow, and I'm here by choice. Another pause, then, Mrs. Vale, I need to see you, face to face. A man of conscience can't walk away without ensuring a young lady's welfare. Gideon started to object, but Clara put her hand on his arm. Open the door, she said quietly. If we refuse, he'll just use it against us. Clara, trust me, please. Gideon stared at her for a long moment, then cursed under his breath and moved to the door. He opened it slowly, the rifle never leaving his hands, and Clara got her first real look at Silas Crow. He was tall and well-dressed, his clothes expensive, even covered in trail dust. His face was handsome in a severe way, weathered but distinguished, with steel-gray hair and cold blue eyes that assessed her like she was livestock. Behind him stood 3 men on horseback, all armed, all watching the cabin with predatory interest. Crow's gaze swept over Clara, and she fought the urge to step back. Mrs. Vale, you're looking well? I'm fine, Mr. Crow. I'm relieved to hear it. When I learned of your sudden marriage, I was concerned. These mountains can be dangerous for a young woman unused to frontier life. His smile didn't reach his eyes. If you ever find yourself in need of assistance, my ranch is always open. I consider it a Christian duty to help those in distress. Clara lifted her chin. I'm not in distress. My husband treats me well, and I'm content here. Content. Crow repeated the word like it was distasteful. That's a modest ambition for a young woman. I'd hope to offer you more than contentment, security, status, a proper home instead of this cabin. This cabin is my home, Clara said, her voice stronger now, and I'm grateful for it. Crow's expression hardened slightly. I see. Well, I suppose some women prefer simplicity to comfort. He turned his attention to Gideon. Vale, I'm a reasonable man. I understand you paid certain debts to secure this marriage. I'm prepared to reimburse you double what you spent, plus a finder's fee. Name your price. She's not for sale, Gideon said flatly. Everything's for sale if the price is right. Not her? Not ever. Gideon's grip on the rifle tightened. I suggest you leave, Crow, before this conversation becomes something neither of us wants. For a moment, real rage flashed across Crow's face. Then he smoothed it away, replaced it with that cold smile. Very well. I can see I'm not welcome here. He tipped his hat to Clara. Mrs. Vale, should you ever need help, remember my offer. A woman shouldn't have to suffer a hard life out of misplaced loyalty. He turned his horse and rode away, his men following. They disappeared down the trail, but the threat lingered in the air like smoke. Gideon slammed the door and rounded on Clara. What the hell were you thinking? I told you to stay hidden. And let him think you were holding me prisoner? That would have given him exactly what he wanted. Clara's hands shook with delayed fear, but she kept her voice steady. He came here to provoke a confrontation or find ammunition to use against us. I couldn't let him get either. You could have been hurt. He wasn't going to hurt me in front of witnesses. He's too smart for that. Clara grabbed Gideon's arm. Don't you see? This was a test. He wanted to see if we'd panic, if I'd run to him, if you'd give him a reason to claim abuse or kidnapping. We passed by not giving him what he wanted. Gideon stared at her, his chest heaving. Then slowly, the tension drained out of him. You're right. I know you're right. But seeing him here, knowing he was that close to you, he ran a hand through his hair. I can't lose someone else to him, Clara. I can't. The vulnerability in his voice cracked something open in Clara's chest. She stepped closer and did something she'd never done before. She reached up and touched his scarred cheek. He flinched but didn't pull away. You won't, she said firmly. I'm not Daniel. I'm not going into this blind or alone. We're in this together now, remember? Partners. Gideon's hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his face. His palm was warm and calloused. Partners, he repeated hoarsely. They stood there in the doorway, connected by touch and shared fear. And Clara realized that something had fundamentally changed. This wasn't a marriage of convenience anymore, not entirely. Somewhere between the storm and the stories, in this moment, they'd become something more. Not lovers, not yet, but allies. People who'd chosen to stand together against a common enemy. He'll be back, Gideon said finally. That was just reconnaissance. Next time, he'll have a plan. Then we'll be ready. You sound awfully confident for someone who's been here less than 3 weeks. Clara managed a shaky smile. I'm terrified, actually. But I learned a long time ago that being scared doesn't mean you get to quit. You just keep moving forward until either the fear stops or you do. Gideon studied her face like he was seeing her for the first time. You're stronger than you look. I'd have to be. The world doesn't let women be weak and survive. No, he agreed quietly. It doesn't. They stood there a moment longer, then Gideon gently pulled away and closed the door. He checked the shutters, verified the rifle was loaded, and settled into the chair by the fire like he was preparing for a siege. Clara watched him and understood. The fragile peace they'd built over the past 2 weeks was over. The war with Silas Crow had officially begun, and there was no going back now. She was part of it, whether she'd chosen it or not. The only question was how much it would cost them before it ended. That night, neither of them slept well. Clara lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling beams while Gideon kept watch from the rocking chair, his rifle across his lap. Every sound outside made them both tense. The wind through the pines, an animal moving through the underbrush, the creak of snow settling on the roof. Normal sounds that now felt loaded with threat. Around 3 in the morning, Clara gave up pretending and climbed out of bed. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and padded across the cold floor to sit in the chair opposite Gideon. Can't sleep either? He asked quietly. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face. Those cold eyes. Clara pulled the blanket tighter. He looked at me like I was something he'd already bought and you'd stolen. That's exactly how he sees it. Men like Crow don't understand that people aren't property. Gideon's jaw tightened. He'll try again. Probably soon. He's not the patient type when he wants something. What will he do? Hard to say. He's got money, which means he's got options. Could try to bribe the territorial marshal to investigate me for kidnapping. Could send men to burn us out and claim it was an accident. Could wait until I'm away from the cabin and try to take you by force. Gideon's voice was grim. That's the problem with Crow. He's not predictable in his methods, just in his goals. He wants you, and he wants me punished for interfering. How he accomplishes both is anyone's guess. Clara's stomach churned. Maybe I should leave. Go somewhere else. Somewhere he can't find me. It's me he wants, not you. If I disappeared, no. The word came out sharp and final. First, you've got nowhere to go. No money, no contacts, and winter's already locked in. You wouldn't make it 50 miles before you froze or starved. Second, running would just prove to Crow that threatening us works. He'd hunt you down out of principle. Gideon leaned forward. And third, I didn't marry you just to watch you run off into danger alone. We're in this together now, Clara. That means we stay together. Even if staying gets you killed? I've been on borrowed time since Danny died. If Crow finally catches up to me, at least I'll have cost him something first. He paused. But I don't plan on dying. I've survived 12 years of him wanting me dead. I can survive a bit longer. Clara studied his face in the firelight. You talk about death like it doesn't scare you. It doesn't. What scares me is failing again. Letting someone else get hurt because I wasn't careful enough, smart enough, fast enough. His voice went rough. That terrifies me. The honesty of it made Clara's chest ache. She understood that fear intimately. The fear of failing, of not being enough, of watching helplessly as bad things happened to people you cared about. She'd felt it every day watching her father destroy himself, knowing there was nothing she could do to stop him. Then we don't fail, she said firmly. We plan. We prepare. We make sure he doesn't get what he wants. Gideon's mouth quirked in something almost like a smile. You're getting awful comfortable with the idea of fighting a man who's killed at least 4 people and ruined dozens more. I don't have much choice, do I? It's fight or surrender, and I'm done surrendering to men who think they own me. Clara met his eyes. My father surrendered to his demons, and it destroyed him. I won't make the same mistake. Fair enough? Gideon stood and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. We need to think strategically. Crow's biggest advantage is resources. Money, men, legal connections. Our advantage is location. He can't get to us easily up here, and any move he makes will be visible before it arrives. We use that. How? We set up warning systems. Tripwires on the trails, signals we can use to communicate if we get separated. Escape routes we both know by heart. He turned to face her. And we make sure you know how to defend yourself if it comes to that. Clara's pulse jumped. You want to teach me to shoot? I want to teach you to survive. Shooting's part of it, but not all of it. You need to know how to move quietly, how to read tracks, how to stay warm if you're caught outside, how to find your way back here if you get lost. His expression was serious. I need to know that if something happens to me, you'll be able to take care of yourself long enough to get to safety. The thought of Gideon dying and leaving her alone up here made Clara's throat tight, but she forced herself to nod. All right, teach me. They started the next morning. Gideon was a demanding but patient teacher, and Clara discovered she had a natural aptitude for practical skills, even if her hands shook the first dozen times she held the rifle. He taught her how to load and clean the weapons, how to aim using breath control, how to compensate for wind and distance. He made her practice until her shoulders ached and her fingers were numb, but he never got angry when she missed, just corrected her stance and had her try again. You're not trying to be perfect, he said on the third day of practice. You're trying to be good enough to make someone think twice about attacking. That's all. Just good enough to buy yourself time. Clara squeezed the trigger and hit the target, a piece of wood Gideon had marked with charcoal. Dead center. Pride swelled in her chest. Better, Gideon said. Again. They fell into a new routine over the following weeks. Mornings were for practical training, shooting, tracking, survival skills. Afternoons were for normal work, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the cabin and barn. Evenings they spent planning, going over scenarios, identifying vulnerabilities in their defenses. It was exhausting and terrifying and strangely empowering. Claire had never been taught that she could defend herself, that she had agency in dangerous situations. Growing up, the message had always been, stay quiet, stay small, let men handle the dangerous things. But Gideon treated her like an equal partner, someone capable of learning and fighting and surviving. Why didn't anyone ever teach me this before? Clara asked one evening as they cleaned the rifles together. Gideon glanced at her. Because most men don't want women who can defend themselves. They want women who need them. Keeps the power imbalance in place. You don't seem worried about power imbalance. I'm not interested in power over you. I'm interested in both of us staying alive. He set down the cleaning rod. Besides, you're more useful to me competent than helpless. Helpless people are just liabilities waiting to get you killed. It wasn't a romantic sentiment, but Clara found it oddly touching anyway. Gideon valued her capability, her strength, her usefulness. That was its own form of respect. December crept in with more snow and temperatures that made Clara's bones ache. The cabin stayed warm enough, but venturing outside required layering every piece of clothing she owned. Gideon showed her how to wrap cloth around her face to prevent frostbite, how to recognize the early signs of hypothermia, how to build an emergency shelter if she got caught in a storm. Practical knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death up here. They were checking the traps one morning when Gideon suddenly froze, his hand shooting out to stop Clara. She opened her mouth to ask what was wrong, but he pressed a finger to his lips and pointed. There in the snow, cutting across their trail, were boot prints. Fresh ones. Someone had been here recently. Someone who wasn't them. Gideon knelt and examined the tracks carefully. His face went hard. 2 men. Maybe 3 hours ago. They circled the cabin, checked the barn, then headed back down the mountain. Clara's heart kicked into a faster rhythm. Crow's men? Has to be. Nobody else would be up here in this cold. He stood and scanned the tree line, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. They're scouting us, learning our patterns, our defenses, preparing for something. What do we do? We go back to the cabin, now. Stay behind me and step exactly where I step. If someone's watching, I don't want them knowing you can track." They moved quickly but carefully through the snow. Clara's nerves screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to match Gideon's measured pace. Running would just make her a target. When they finally reached the cabin, Gideon did a thorough check of the perimeter before letting her inside. "Pack a bag," he said once the door was secured. "Emergency supplies, warm clothes, matches, some food. Keep it small enough to carry easily. Hide it in the loft." "You think they're coming soon?" "I think they're coming eventually, and we need to be ready when they do." He moved to the window and stared out at the forest. "Crow's patience is running out. He made his polite attempt to buy you back, and when that failed, he moved to surveillance. Next step is action." Clara's hands shook as she gathered supplies, but she kept moving. Fear was useless unless you let it paralyze you. She'd learned that watching her father drown in his own terror of facing his failures, she wouldn't make the same mistake. That night, Gideon broke his own rule and came down from the loft to sleep near the door, his rifle within arm's reach. Clara didn't argue. The boot prints had changed everything. They weren't just isolated anymore. They were actively being hunted. "Gideon?" she whispered into the darkness. "Yeah? If they come, if something happens to you, what should I do?" Silence stretched between them. Then, "There's a bag hidden under the floorboards near the hearth. It has money in it, documents proving our marriage is legal, and a letter I wrote to the federal marshal in Silver Creek. His name's Garrett Hayes. He's straight, doesn't take bribes, and he's been looking for a way to go after Crow for years. If I die, you take that bag and you run for Silver Creek. Give Hayes everything. Tell him what happened. He'll protect you." Clara's throat felt tight. "You've been planning this." "I've been planning for every scenario I can imagine. That's how you stay alive when someone like Crow wants you dead." He paused. "Promise me, Clara. If it comes down to your life or mine, you run. Don't try to be a hero. Just survive." "That's not fair. Promise me." Clara closed her eyes. "I promise." "Good." She heard him shift position. "Now try to sleep. We'll need our strength for whatever comes next." But sleep didn't come easily. Clara lay awake listening to Gideon's breathing, thinking about federal marshals and hidden money, and a future where she might have to run for her life through a frozen mountain forest. This wasn't the life she'd imagined as a girl, but then again, none of her life had gone according to plan. At least now she had options. At least now she wasn't completely helpless. The next morning brought a surprise visitor, but not the one they'd been dreading. Clara was washing dishes when she heard a horse whinny outside, and Gideon moved to the window with his rifle ready. Then his posture relaxed slightly. "It's Ben Tucker," he said. "He's safe." "Who?" "Local trapper. Trades with me sometimes. Lives about 15 miles east." Gideon opened the door as a grizzled man in his 60s dismounted from a mule that looked as weathered as its rider. "Val," the man called out. "Got a minute?" "Come on in, Ben. Coffee's hot." Ben Tucker stomped the snow off his boots and entered, nodding respectfully to Clara. "Ma'am, you must be the new Mrs. everyone's talking about." "Clara Vale," she said, offering her hand. Ben shook it with surprising gentleness for someone whose hands looked like tree bark. "Pleasure. Sorry to intrude, but I thought Vale here should know something." Ben accepted the coffee Gideon offered and took a long drink. "I was down in Crow's territory 2 days ago, trading pelts. Heard some of his men talking. They're planning something up this way. Didn't catch all the details, but I heard your name mentioned, Vale, and I heard them say soon." Gideon's jaw clenched. "How many men?" 6, maybe 8. All armed. They're waiting for something. Weather, maybe, or orders from Crow himself. But it's coming." Ben looked between them. "You two need to be careful. Crow's got a mean streak, and from what I hear, he's taken this marriage of yours real personal." "Appreciate the warning," Gideon said. "Figure you would. You helped me out of a tight spot last spring. Least I can do is return the favor." Ben finished his coffee and stood. "If things get bad, my place is open to you both. It ain't much, but it's shelter, and Crow's men don't know about it. We'll keep that in mind." After Ben left, Clara turned to Gideon. 6 to 8 men. How do we defend against that?" "We don't. Not directly." Gideon moved to the table and spread out a rough map he'd drawn of the area. "Fighting them head-on would be suicide. But we've got advantages they don't. We know this terrain. We know where to hide, where to run, where to make a stand if we have to. They're coming into our territory, which means we control the field. Clara studied the map. You're talking about guerrilla tactics. He looked up, surprised. Where'd you learn that term? I can read, Gideon. Mrs. Patterson had books about the war. I know what guerrilla fighting is. She pointed to a narrow section of trail on the map. If they come up the main trail, they'll have to pass through here. It's a bottleneck. We could use that. Gideon's expression shifted to something like respect. You're right. We could set up obstacles, slow them down, maybe even separate them if we're lucky. They spent the rest of the day planning, and Clara discovered she had a tactical mind she'd never had reason to use before. Growing up, women weren't supposed to think about strategy or defense. That was men's work. But up here, survival trumped propriety, and Gideon valued her ideas as much as his own. We should move some supplies to the root cellar, Clara suggested. If they burn the cabin, we'll need somewhere to fall back to. Good thinking, and we should cache weapons along the escape routes. If we have to run, we won't have time to gather everything. They worked together, two people preparing for war, and Clara felt something settle in her chest. This was partnership. This was what it meant to face danger alongside someone who trusted your competence and judgment. It wasn't romantic, but it was real in a way her childhood dreams of marriage had never been. That evening, as they sat by the fire reviewing their plans, Clara asked something that had been bothering her. Why did you really come down from this mountain, Gideon? You'd been up here 5 years, staying away from Crow, staying safe. Why risk everything now? Gideon was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. Because I was tired of hiding, tired of letting him win by default. Danny died trying to stop Crow from hurting people, and I ran away and hid in the mountains like a coward. I told myself I was being strategic, waiting for the right moment. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of ending up like Danny, scared of failing again. He looked at her. Then I heard about you, and I realized I had a choice. I could stay hidden and let another innocent person get destroyed, or I could do something. I couldn't save Danny, but maybe I could save you. Maybe that would be enough to make me something other than the coward who let his brother die unavenged. You're not a coward, Clara said fiercely. Cowards don't spend their life savings to protect strangers. Cowards don't teach their wives to defend themselves. Cowards don't stand up to men like Silas Crow. Then what am I? You're someone who's been hurt badly and is still trying to do the right thing despite it. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. That's not cowardice. That's courage. Gideon's fingers tightened around hers, and for a moment they just sat there, holding hands in the firelight, two damaged people finding comfort in each other's presence. It wasn't love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was connection, and that was enough. The attack came 3 days later in the dead of night, exactly when they'd expected it. Clara woke to Gideon's hand over her mouth and his voice urgent in her ear. They're here. Don't make a sound. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She nodded, and he removed his hand. In the darkness, she could hear them. Men's voices outside, hushed but aggressive. The crunch of boots in snow, the clink of metal on metal. Weapons being readied. Gideon moved with silent efficiency, grabbing the emergency bag from the loft and handing Clara her coat. She pulled it on with shaking hands while he checked the rifle and pistol. His face was calm, focused, every bit the tracker and hunter he'd been before he'd become her husband. Remember the plan, he whispered. If we get separated, head for the root cellar tunnel and then to Ben Tucker's place. Don't stop. Don't look back. Understand? Clara nodded, terror making her mute. A voice called out from the darkness. Vale, we know you're in there. Send the girl out, and we'll let you live. Gideon's jaw clenched. He moved to the window and called back. You're on my property illegally. Leave now, or I'll defend my home. Don't be stupid, Vale. It's 8 of us, and 1 of you. We've got you surrounded. Then you've got 8 men about to learn what happens when you threaten a man who's got nothing left to lose. Gideon pulled Clara toward the hearth. He lifted the hidden floorboard and revealed the entrance to the root cellar. Go, now. I'll hold them off and follow you. I'm not leaving you. Clara, don't argue. Go. The window shattered as someone fired through it. Glass sprayed across the cabin, and Clara yelped. Gideon returned fire immediately, the rifle's report deafening in the enclosed space. Someone outside screamed. Go! Gideon roared. Clara dropped into the root cellar, her legs shaking so badly she nearly fell. Above her, she heard more gunfire, more shouting. The cabin floor shook as heavy boots pounded across it. She wanted to climb back up, to help, to not abandon Gideon to face them alone, but she'd promised to run if it came to it. Sobbing, hating herself, Clara grabbed a lantern from the shelf and ran into the tunnel. The passage was narrow and low, forcing her to crouch as she moved. Roots hung from the ceiling, and the walls were rough earth that crumbled when she brushed against them. Behind her, the sounds of fighting continued, gunshots breaking wood, men shouting. She forced herself to keep moving, one foot in front of the other, even as tears streamed down her face. The tunnel opened into the forest about 50 feet from the cabin, hidden behind a snow-covered boulder. Clara emerged gasping, disoriented, the night air so cold it burned her lungs. She could see the cabin now, see dark figures moving around it, see firelight flickering through the broken windows. They were going to burn it. They were going to burn Gideon inside. Clara's hands found the pistol Gideon had made her carry. She'd promised to run, but she couldn't. She couldn't leave him to die while she ran away like a coward. Danny had died fighting for what was right, and Gideon had spent 12 years carrying that guilt. She wouldn't add to it by abandoning him now. She circled through the trees, moving as quietly as Gideon had taught her, using the shadows and snow for cover. She could see them now. 7 men, heavily armed, gathering near the cabin's front door. One held a torch. Where was the 8th man? Where was Gideon? Then she saw him. Gideon, emerging from the barn with his rifle raised. He'd never been in the cabin at all. He'd sent her away and then used the confusion to get outside, to flank them. "Looking for me?" Gideon's voice cut through the night. The men spun, raising their weapons, but Gideon was faster. He fired once, twice, 3 times. Men dropped, screaming, clutching wounds. Not killing shots. Gideon was shooting to disable, not to murder. The remaining men scattered, seeking cover, returning fire. Clara saw movement to her left, the 8th man, circling around behind Gideon, rifle aimed at his back. She didn't think. She raised her pistol, steadied her breathing the way Gideon had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, but close enough to make the man dive for cover. He turned toward her, surprised, and Gideon used that distraction to put a bullet in the man's shoulder. He went down hard. "Clara, run!" Gideon shouted, but she couldn't run. The fight was chaos now. Men emerging from cover, guns firing, the whole clearing lit by muzzle flashes and that terrible torch still burning in the snow where someone had dropped it. Clara saw a man aiming at Gideon while Gideon was focused elsewhere, and she fired again. This time she hit him in the leg, and he collapsed with a howl. She was good enough, just like Gideon had said, good enough to buy time. Then hoofbeats thundered up the trail and new voices joined the chaos. Clara's heart sank. More of Crow's men, reinforcements. They were dead. But the new arrivals weren't Crow's men. "This is Sheriff Garrett Hayes," a voice boomed. "Drop your weapons. You're under arrest." The federal marshal. He'd come. But how? Why? Crow's men, wounded and outnumbered, threw down their weapons. Some tried to run and were quickly caught. Within minutes, it was over. The clearing fell silent except for the groans of injured men and the nervous stamping of horses. A man in his 40s with a marshal's star pinned to his coat dismounted and walked toward Gideon. "Vale, you all right?" "Hayes?" Gideon lowered his rifle, his hands shaking slightly. "What are you doing here?" "Got an interesting letter about 3 weeks ago. Anonymous. Told me Silas Crow was planning to force a marriage with a girl in Black Hollow, and that if I wanted proof of his criminal activities, I should keep an eye on this mountain." Hayes looked around at the wounded men. Seems the letter was right. Gideon's eyes widened. Ben Tucker. Don't know who sent it, but I've been camped down the mountain for 2 weeks, waiting to see what Crow would do. When his men rode past our camp tonight, we followed. Hayes gestured to Crow's men being rounded up by deputies. That's armed assault, attempted kidnapping, and attempted arson. More than enough to bring Crow in for questioning. And I'm betting at least one of these boys will talk in exchange for leniency. Clara emerged from the trees on shaking legs. Gideon saw her and crossed the distance in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms. She clung to him, her whole body trembling with delayed shock. "You didn't run," he said hoarsely. "I couldn't. I'm sorry. I promised. but I couldn't. You probably saved my life. He pulled back to look at her face, and his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. You crazy brave woman. You probably saved my life. Hayes cleared his throat. Mrs. Vale, you're the woman from the letter, Clara Whitmore. Clara Vale, she corrected, her voice surprisingly steady. And yes, Silas Crow tried to buy me from my father. My husband intervened. Well, your husband just gave me exactly what I needed to finally go after Crow properly. Hayes smiled grimly. We've got 7 witnesses here who'll testify to avoid hanging for attempted murder. That's enough to crack this case wide open. Clara looked up at Gideon, saw the cautious hope in his eyes, and felt something crack open in her own chest. They'd survived. They'd actually survived. But as the deputies loaded the wounded men onto horses and Hayes gave orders to his men, Clara knew this wasn't over. Crow himself was still free, still powerful, still dangerous. This was just the first battle. The war was far from won. The ride down the mountain took 4 hours in the pre-dawn darkness, and every minute of it felt like being dragged through broken glass. Clara sat in front of Gideon on his horse, tucked against his chest because she was shaking too badly to ride on her own. Behind them came Marshal Hayes and his deputies, escorting the 7 wounded men who'd come to burn them out. The 8th had died before they could get him stabilized, not from Clara's shot, but from blood loss after Gideon had hit his femoral artery. Clara tried not to think about that, about the fact that a man was dead because she and Gideon had fought back. Tried and failed. He would have killed us, Gideon murmured against her ear, reading her thoughts like he was getting better at doing. You did what you had to do. I know, Clara's voice came out hollow. Doesn't make it easier. No, it doesn't. His arms tightened around her waist. But you're alive. That's what matters. They descended into Black Hollow just as dawn broke pale and cold over the eastern peaks. The town was barely stirring, smoke rising from a few chimneys, but news of the marshal's presence spread fast. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, a crowd had gathered. Clara saw familiar faces. Mrs. Patterson, the seamstress, Martha, merchants and miners and saloon girls all pressing close to see what had happened. And there, standing on the steps of the Lucky Strike saloon, was her father. Thomas Whitmore looked smaller than Clara remembered, shrunken by drink and guilt, his eyes red-rimmed and haunted. When he saw her, something crumpled in his face. Clara, he called out, his voice breaking. Clara, girl, But Clara turned her face away. She had nothing to say to the man who'd sold her to save his own skin. Whatever guilt he felt now was too little, too late. Marshal Hayes dismounted and helped Clara down while Gideon secured the horses. The crowd pressed closer, questions flying like arrows. What happened up there? Is it true Crow sent men after them? Who's dead? Hayes held up his hand for silence. I'll make a statement once I've got these prisoners secured and medical attention arranged for the wounded. Until then, I need everyone to clear the street and let us do our jobs. The crowd reluctantly dispersed, though Clara could feel their eyes following her as Hayes ushered them into the sheriff's office. The local sheriff, a heavy-set man named Porter, who everyone knew was on Crow's payroll, stood behind his desk looking like he'd swallowed something rotten. Hayes, he said stiffly, this is outside your jurisdiction. Attempted murder of a federal witness makes it my jurisdiction, Hayes replied smoothly. And since these men crossed territorial lines to commit their crimes, that makes it a federal matter. You can cooperate, Sheriff Porter, or you can explain to a judge why you obstructed a federal investigation. Your choice. Porter's jaw worked, but he stepped aside. Clara watched the exchange and understood. Hayes was giving Porter a chance to distance himself from Crow before everything came crashing down. Smart. You caught more rats when you gave them an escape route. Hayes settled behind Porter's desk like he owned it and pulled out a notebook. Mrs. Vale, I'll need your statement about what happened tonight. Start from when you first heard the men approaching. Clara told the story as clearly as she could, her voice steady, even though her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Gideon stood beside her the whole time, his presence a solid comfort. When she got to the part about shooting at Crow's men, Hayes's eyebrows rose slightly. You engaged armed assailants? She saved my life, Gideon said flatly. I was focused on 3 men when an 8th came up behind me. Clara's shot forced him into cover and gave me time to respond. If she hadn't been there, I'd be dead. Hayes wrote that down carefully. And you're prepared to testify to this under oath? I am. Good. Because I'm going to need both of you to testify when we bring Crow in. Hayes looked up. And make no mistake, we're bringing him in. 7 of his men attacked a lawfully married couple on their own property. That's conspiracy to commit murder, attempted kidnapping, attempted arson. Even if every judge in the territory is in his pocket, I can take this to the federal court. Crow's done. Clara wanted to believe him, but she'd lived in Crow's shadow too long to think it would be that easy. What if the men don't talk? What if they claim they were acting independently? Then we prove otherwise. I've got 3 deputies interviewing them separately right now. Men talk when they think their partners might throw them under the wagon to save themselves. Someone will break. Hayes closed his notebook. But I won't lie to you. This is going to get uglier before it gets better. Crow has resources. He'll fight back. You 2 need to be prepared for that. We're still in danger, Clara said. It wasn't a question. You're in more danger now than before, Hayes admitted. Before tonight, Crow could claim he had no direct involvement. Now, his men have been caught red-handed trying to kill you. He'll be desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. But they also make dangerous choices. He leaned forward. I can offer you protective custody. Put you somewhere safe until the trial. Gideon shook his head. We go into protective custody, and Crow knows he's got us scared. Makes us look like liars hiding from consequences. We stay visible, stay in the open, and dare him to try something else while everyone's watching. That's risky. Everything's risky right now. Gideon's voice was hard. At least this way we're not trapped somewhere, waiting for him to find us. We can see him coming. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to take the offered protection and hide until this nightmare was over. But she looked at Gideon's face and understood. This wasn't just about safety. This was about finally standing up to the man who'd killed his brother and terrorized the territory for years. Running now would feel like losing, and Gideon had lost enough. We stay, she said quietly. Together. Hayes studied them both, then nodded slowly. All right, but I'm stationing a deputy outside wherever you're staying, and if I give the word to run, you run. Understood? Understood. They found lodging at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, the same place Clara had lived before her marriage. Mrs. Patterson fussed over them, bringing tea and blankets and asking questions Clara was too exhausted to answer. She let Gideon handle the talking while she sat in the small room they'd rented and tried to process everything that had happened. She'd shot a man. Maybe killed him. She wasn't sure if her bullet or Gideon's had been the fatal one, and part of her didn't want to know. She'd fought back against armed men, had chosen to stay and fight instead of running like she'd been told, had discovered she was capable of violence when pushed far enough. Who was she now? Not the frightened girl who'd walked down that church aisle 6 weeks ago. That girl had died somewhere between the marriage and the gunfight, replaced by someone harder, someone who knew how to shoot and track and defend herself. Someone who'd looked at death and decided to fight instead of submit. You're thinking too hard, Gideon said, entering the room and closing the door behind him. I can see it on your face. I'm trying to figure out who I am now. You're Clara Vale. Same person you were this morning, just with more experience. He sat beside her on the narrow bed. Trauma doesn't change who you are at your core. It just reveals what was already there. And what was already there? A woman who's stronger than she knew, who's been surviving impossible situations her whole life and just didn't realize that counted as strength. His voice gentled. You think courage means not being afraid, but real courage is being terrified and doing what needs doing anyway. That's what you showed tonight. Clara's eyes burned with unshed tears. I was so scared. I know. I thought you were going to die. I thought they were going to kill you and burn you in that cabin, and I couldn't. Her voice broke. I couldn't let that happen, even though I promised to run. Gideon pulled her against his chest, and Clara let herself cry for the first time since the attack. She cried for the terror, for the violence, for the man who died in the snow. She cried for the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become. And Gideon held her through all of it, his hand steady on her back, his heartbeat solid under her ear. You did good, he murmured. Better than good. You did everything right. Doesn't feel right. It never does, but you're alive, and I'm alive, and tomorrow we're going to wake up and keep fighting. That's what survival looks like. It's not pretty or noble or easy. It's just stubbornly refusing to die when someone wants you dead. Clara pulled back to look at him. His face was exhausted, lines of strain around his eyes and mouth, a bruise blooming on his jaw where someone must have hit him during the fight. He looked human and fallible, and nothing like the monster Black Hollow had made him out to be. "I'm glad I married you," she said. Something raw and vulnerable crossed Gideon's face. "Even though I dragged you into this mess? You didn't drag me. You gave me a choice between one nightmare and another, and yours came with a fighting chance." She reached up and touched his scarred cheek. "I'm glad it was you." Gideon caught her hand and pressed his lips to her palm, a gesture so tender it made Clara's breath catch. "We should sleep. Tomorrow's going to be rough." But neither of them moved. They sat there on that narrow bed, holding on to each other like lifelines, two people who'd fought their way through hell and were trying to figure out what came after. Finally, Clara asked the question that had been burning in her mind. What happens if the men don't talk? What if Hayes can't prove Crow ordered the attack? Then we testify to what we know. We tell the court about Crow's pattern of forced marriages, about the women who died suspiciously, about his threats. We make enough noise that the federal government has to investigate, even if the local courts won't. Gideon's jaw set. And if that doesn't work, we disappear. Change our names, head west, start over somewhere Crow's reach doesn't extend. You'd give up your home? Your cabin? I'd give up anything to keep you safe. He said it simply, like it was obvious. The cabin's just a place. You're a person who matters. The words settled over Clara like a blanket. She'd spent her whole life being treated like she was disposable, like her value was measured only in what she could provide to men. But Gideon looked at her and saw someone worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth more than property or revenge. "I'm falling in love with you," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Gideon went very still. "Clara, I know this isn't that kind of marriage. I know we agreed it was just legal protection, but I can't help it." She met his eyes. "You make me feel like I matter, like I'm not just something to be used and discarded. You teach me to defend myself instead of demanding I need you. You respect my opinions and my strength. How am I supposed to not fall in love with that?" For a long moment, Gideon didn't respond. Then he cupped her face in his hands, his touch achingly gentle. "I don't deserve you." "That's not an answer." "I know." He rested his forehead against hers. "I've been half in love with you since the wedding, when you stood there in that church looking terrified but refusing to break. I told myself it was just protectiveness, just guilt about dragging you into my war with Crow. But watching you fight tonight, seeing your courage..." His voice roughened. "You're everything I'm not. Everything Danny was. The best parts of humanity that I thought died with him." "Gideon, let me finish." He pulled back to look at her. "I'm damaged, Clara. I've done things that would make you sick. I've killed men and felt nothing about it. I've spent 12 years feeding my rage instead of letting it go. I'm not a good man, just a less terrible one. You deserve better than that." "Stop telling me what I deserve." Clara's voice came out fierce. "I know what I deserve. I deserve someone who sees me as an equal, someone who trusts me with the truth even when it's ugly, someone who fights alongside me instead of trying to control me. You're all of that, Gideon. Your past doesn't change it." "My past could destroy your future." "My future was already destroyed the moment my father sold me. You gave me a new one." She gripped his wrists where his hand still cradled her face. "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to let me love you anyway." Gideon's eyes shone with unshed tears. Then he kissed her, soft and desperate, like she was something precious he was afraid of breaking. Clara kissed him back, pouring everything she couldn't say into the contact, gratitude and fear and hope and love all tangled together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gideon rested his forehead against hers again. "I love you," he whispered. "I don't know when it happened or how to stop it, but I love you, and that terrifies me more than Crow ever could." "Why?" "Because loving someone means having something to lose, and I've already lost everyone I've ever loved. I don't think I could survive losing you too." Clara's heart ached for him, for the fear that drove him, for all the loss he'd carried alone for so long. "Then we'll just have to make sure neither of us loses. We fight together, we survive together, we win together. And if we can't win, Then we go down fighting, and at least we won't be alone. It wasn't a romantic promise. It wasn't even an optimistic one. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it was enough. They slept in each other's arms that night, too exhausted for anything more than comfort. But Clara felt safer than she had since this whole nightmare began. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. Not as a marriage of convenience, but as partners who'd chosen each other despite everything working against them. Morning came too fast. Clara woke to raised voices outside their window. Angry voices, lots of them. She sat up, disoriented, and found Gideon already awake, standing at the window with his rifle. "What's happening?" "Town meeting. They're arguing about us." His voice was tight. "Some want us gone, say we're bringing trouble. Others are defending us. It's getting heated." Clara joined him at the window and looked down. Sure enough, a crowd had gathered in the street below, faces red with anger and fear. She recognized her father in the crowd, and Crow's banker, and half a dozen merchants who relied on Crow's business to survive. "They're going to run us out," Clara said hollowly. "Maybe. Or maybe enough people are tired of Crow's stranglehold that they'll finally stand up." Gideon didn't sound convinced. "Either way, we need to be ready to move fast." Before Clara could respond, someone pounded on their door. She grabbed the pistol Gideon had given her while he moved to answer, rifle ready. "Who is it?" "Marshal Hayes, open up." Gideon opened the door. Hayes looked grim. "We've got a problem. One of Crow's men talked, gave us everything, dates, victims, payoffs. It's enough to arrest Crow on multiple charges, but there's more." He paused. "Crow's disappeared. Left his ranch sometime last night. No one's seen him since." Clara's stomach dropped. "He's running. Or preparing for something worse." Hayes looked between them. "I've got deputies searching, but Crow knows this territory better than anyone except maybe Vale here. He could be anywhere, and a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind." "He'll come for us," Gideon said flatly. "It's personal now. He's lost everything, his reputation, his power, his freedom, all because of us. He won't run without trying to hurt us first. That's what I'm afraid of." Hayes stepped into the room. "I'm pulling you two out of here. There's a safe house in Silver Creek, federal protection, armed guards. You'll stay there until we've got Crow in custody." "No." Gideon's voice was hard. "That's exactly what he wants. Us isolated somewhere, cut off from help, easier to attack. We stay here in public, where everyone can see us. And if he comes after you anyway, then at least we'll see him coming." Gideon moved to the window and looked down at the crowd. "Half those people down there are scared of Crow. The other half hate him, but are too afraid to act. We run and hide. We prove their fear is justified. We stay and fight. Maybe some of them will finally stand with us." Hayes looked like he wanted to argue, but couldn't find a good counter-argument. Finally, he sighed. "You're making my job harder than it needs to be. We're making Crow's job harder too. That's what matters." The day dragged on with terrible slowness. Clara and Gideon stayed in the boarding house, but they kept watch, taking turns at the window, tracking everyone who moved through the street. The town buzzed with tension. People huddled in small groups, talking in low voices, casting nervous glances at the marshal's office and the boarding house alike. Black Hollow had never seen this much law enforcement or federal attention. The pressure was building towards something, some breaking point none of them could predict. Mrs. Patterson brought them lunch and news. "Your father's asking to see you," she told Clara. "He's down at the saloon, been drinking since morning. Says he needs to apologize." Clara's jaw tightened. "Tell him I have nothing to say to him." "Clara, I know he did you wrong, but he's still your father. He stopped being my father when he sold me to erase his debts." Clara's voice was cold. "Whatever guilt he feels now, that's his burden. I'm done carrying it for him." Mrs. Patterson looked sad but nodded. "I'll tell him." After she left, Gideon touched Clara's shoulder. "You sure about that?" "Yes. I spent 3 years trying to save him from himself, and all it got me was a ring on my finger to pay his gambling markers. I'm done." Clara turned to face him. "Do you think I'm being cruel? I think you're protecting yourself." "That's not cruel. That's survival." He paused. "But if there's anything you need to say to him, say it now, before whatever happens next happens. You don't want to carry regret if you don't have to." Clara considered that. Was there anything she needed to say? Anything that would bring her peace? "Maybe you're right." She stood. I'll go talk to him, briefly. I'm coming with you. They found Thomas Whitmore exactly where Mrs. Patterson had said, slumped at a corner table in the Lucky Strike, a bottle of cheap whiskey in front of him, his face gray and haggard. When he saw Clara, he tried to stand and nearly fell. Gideon caught him and eased him back into his chair. Clara. Her father's voice was thick with drink and tears. My girl, my sweet girl, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did to you. Clara sat across from him, her expression carefully neutral. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry things turned out badly for you. But are you actually sorry for selling me? I didn't have a choice. Everyone has choices. You chose cards over your daughter. You chose whiskey over responsibility. You chose to bury your grief in bottles instead of being there for me when Mama died. Claire's voice stayed steady, but her hands were clenched in her lap. So no, Father, I don't accept your apology, because you're not actually sorry. You're just looking for someone to forgive you so you can forgive yourself. Thomas's face crumpled. I loved your mother. When she died, I loved her too. She was my mother. And I didn't have the luxury of falling apart because someone had to keep us fed and housed. Someone had to do the laundry and cooking and all the work Mama used to do. Clara leaned forward. I was 17 years old and grieving, and you made me carry your grief on top of mine. Then you sold me like livestock when your choices finally caught up to you. So no, I don't forgive you, and I don't want your apology. Clara, please. But I will say this. Clara's voice softened slightly. I hope you get sober. I hope you find a way to live with yourself. I hope you become the man Mama thought she married. But I won't be there to watch it happen. Whatever relationship we had died the day you agreed to trade me to Gideon for debt forgiveness. She stood, and Gideon stood with her. Thomas reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Goodbye, Father, and they left him there, weeping into his whiskey, and Clara felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness. She wasn't ready for that, and might never be. But closure. She'd said what needed saying. Whatever happened now, she wouldn't carry the weight of unspoken words. How do you feel? Gideon asked as they walked back to the boarding house. Lighter. Clara threaded her fingers through his, like I finally put down something heavy I've been carrying too long. Good. He squeezed her hand. You deserve to feel light. They were halfway back when someone screamed. The sound cut through the street like a knife, high and terrified. Clara and Gideon spun toward it. People were running, pointing toward the edge of town. Smoke rose black and thick against the afternoon sky. Fire! Someone shouted. The marshal's office is on fire. They ran. The whole street ran. By the time they reached the office, flames were already consuming the wooden structure, heat rolling off it in waves. Hayes and his deputies were dragging prisoners out. Crow's men, coughing and stumbling, hands still bound. Where's Porter? Hayes roared. Where's Sheriff Porter? Still inside, a deputy shouted back. He went to get evidence from the back room. Gideon didn't hesitate. He shrugged off his coat, wrapped it around his head and shoulders, and ran straight into the burning building. Gideon! Clara screamed, but he was already gone, swallowed by smoke and flames. Time stretched. Seconds felt like hours. Clara stood frozen, her heart hammering, unable to breathe, unable to think. The fire roared louder, consuming more of the building. Part of the roof collapsed with a crash that made everyone jump back. Then Gideon emerged, half-carrying Sheriff Porter, both of them coughing violently. Hayes and his deputies rushed forward to help. They dragged both men clear, and Clara was there instantly, her hands on Gideon's face, checking for burns, for injuries, for any sign he was seriously hurt. I'm fine, he rasped. I'm fine. You're not fine. You ran into a burning building. Had to. Porter was trapped. Gideon coughed again, his lungs rattling. Crow, he was there. Set the fire and left Porter to die. Hayes heard that, and his face went hard as stone. Which way? East, toward the mountains. Gideon struggled to his feet despite Clara trying to hold him down. He's making for the cabin. He's going to burn it like he tried to burn this. Then we stop him, Hayes signaled to his deputies. Mount up. We ride now. I'm coming, Gideon said. The hell you are, Clara snapped. You just breathed in half a building worth of smoke. It's my cabin. My fight. Gideon looked at her, and his eyes were fierce. This ends today, Clara. One way or another, it ends today. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to demand he stay safe, but she saw the determination in his face and knew it would be useless. This was what Gideon had been preparing for 12 years. The final confrontation with the man who'd killed his brother and destroyed so many lives. She couldn't stop him. She could only stand beside him. "Then I'm coming too," she said. "Clara, we're partners, remember? We face this together, or we don't face it at all." Gideon looked like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Finally, he just pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "Stay behind me. Promise." "I promise to stay as safe as I can. That's the best you're getting." He laughed, the sound rough with smoke damage, and shook his head. "You're going to be the death of me." "Not today," Clara said fiercely. "Not today." They rode hard for the mountains, Hayes and his deputies and Gideon and Clara racing against time in a madman's revenge. The sun was already sinking toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. And somewhere ahead, Silas Crow was waiting with matches and rage, and nothing left to lose. The final battle was coming, and Clara prayed they'd all survive to see the other side of it. The horses struggled through the deepening snow as they climbed higher into the mountains, their breath coming in white plumes, their hooves slipping on ice-slicked rocks. Clara clung to the saddle, her fingers numb despite her gloves, her face stinging from the wind that had picked up as they ascended. Behind her rode Gideon, still coughing occasionally from the smoke he'd inhaled, and Marshal Hayes with 3 of his deputies. They'd left the others behind to secure the prisoners and protect the town in case this was some elaborate diversion. "How much farther?" Hayes called out over the wind. "Another mile," Gideon rasped. "Maybe less. Trail gets narrow up ahead, forces us into single file, good place for an ambush. Then we go careful." Hayes drew his rifle. "Vale, you take point since you know the terrain, but if shooting starts, you let my men handle it. You're a witness, not a deputy." Gideon didn't argue, which told Clara how exhausted he really was. They pushed on as the sun sank lower, throwing long shadows across the snow. The temperature dropped further, and Clara's teeth started chattering despite the layers she wore. How many times had she ridden this trail now? 4? 5? It felt like a lifetime ago that she'd first come up here as a terrified bride. Now she was riding toward a confrontation that could end with any of them dead, and somehow the fear felt different. Sharper, but cleaner. She wasn't afraid of the unknown anymore. She was afraid of losing what she'd found. The trail narrowed as Gideon had predicted, hemmed in by rock walls on one side and a steep drop on the other. They rode in tense silence, every sense alert for danger. Clara kept her hand on the pistol Gideon had given her, her finger near the trigger guard, but not on the trigger itself like he'd taught her. Safety first, until the moment safety no longer mattered. Then they rounded a bend and saw it. The cabin stood silent in the clearing, smoke rising from its chimney like everything was normal. But something felt wrong. Clara couldn't name what exactly, just a prickling awareness that made her skin crawl. Gideon must have felt it too because he held up his hand, stopping the group. "He's here," Gideon said quietly. "I can feel it." "Where?" Hayes scanned the tree line, his rifle ready. "Could be anywhere. The barn, the woods, inside the cabin itself." Gideon's jaw tightened. "He knows I'd come back here. He's waiting for me." "Then we don't give him what he wants." Hayes turned to his deputies. "Johnson, circle around to the barn. Peters, take the high ground behind those rocks. Morrison, you're with me. We approach from 3 sides, flush him out." He looked at Gideon and Clara. "You two stay back. If this goes bad, We're not staying back," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "This is our home, our fight." "Mrs. Vale?" "She's right," Gideon interrupted. "Crow wants me specifically. If I'm not visible, he might do something desperate. Burn the cabin, fire blind into the woods, hurt someone just to draw me out. Better I'm where he can see me." Hayes looked like he wanted to argue, but couldn't find a flaw in the logic. "Fine. But you stay behind cover and you don't engage unless absolutely necessary. Clear?" "Clear." They dismounted and moved into position. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she followed Gideon toward a cluster of trees that offered cover with a clear view of the cabin. The snow was deep here, nearly to her knees, muffling their footsteps but also slowing them down. Everything felt suspended. waiting for something to break the terrible stillness. Then a voice rang out across the clearing, cultured and cold. "Vale, I know you're out there. Why don't you show yourself like a man instead of hiding behind federal badges?" Silas Crow. Clara couldn't see him, but his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the rock walls and trees. Gideon tensed beside her. "Where is he?" "Can't tell," Clara whispered. "The acoustics are all wrong." Hayes made a hand signal to his deputies, and they began moving slowly, carefully, trying to triangulate on Crow's position. But the rancher was smart. He'd chosen his spot well. "You've cost me everything, Vale," Crow's voice rang with rage. "My reputation, my business, my freedom. All because you couldn't let me have one girl, one insignificant girl whose own father was willing to give her up." Clara's hands tightened on her pistol. Insignificant. That's all she'd ever been to men like Crow. A commodity, a piece of property with no value beyond what she could provide. "She's not property," Gideon shouted back, "and she never was yours to claim. Everything in this territory is mine. I built it. I own it." Crow's voice cracked with fury. "You're nothing but a coward who ran to the mountains after failing to avenge his worthless brother, and now you're going to die like he did, with a bullet in your back." The shot came from the cabin's loft window. Gideon yanked Clara down as the bullet whined over their heads and thunked into a tree behind them. Return fire erupted immediately. Hayes and his deputies shooting at the window, wood splintering, glass shattering. "He's in my home," Gideon snarled, and Clara heard something break in his voice. "He's in our home." More shots from the cabin, but Crow was shooting blind now, just trying to keep them pinned. Clara saw movement near the barn. Deputy Johnson circling around. Then she saw something else that made her blood freeze. "Gideon," she breathed, "the barn. There's smoke coming from the barn." He looked and cursed viciously. He set fire to it. "If the horses are still in there—" He didn't finish the sentence, just broke from cover and ran for the barn. Clara heard Hayes shouting behind them, but she was already moving, following Gideon because she'd promised they'd face this together, and she meant it. They hit the barn doors together, Gideon kicking them open. Smoke poured out, thick and black. The mare was inside, terrified, rearing and screaming. Flames licked up the far wall, consuming hay and dried wood. The heat was intense, stealing Clara's breath. Gideon grabbed the mare's halter while Clara yanked open the back door. Together, they got the horse outside and slapped her flank, sending her running for the tree line. The barn groaned ominously, its frame starting to collapse. "Move!" Gideon grabbed Clara's hand and they ran. The barn's roof caved in behind them with a crash and an explosion of sparks. They dove behind a snowbank as burning debris rained down. Clara's ears rang, her lungs ached, and when she looked up, she saw Silas Crow standing on the cabin's porch with a rifle. Time seemed to slow. Crow raised the rifle, aimed it directly at Gideon. His face was twisted with rage and satisfaction. He'd won. He'd drawn Gideon into the open, and now he'd finish what he'd started 12 years ago. Clara didn't think. She raised her pistol and fired. The shot went wide. She was shaking too badly for accuracy. But it was close enough to make Crow flinch. His shot went high. Then Hayes and his deputies opened fire, and Crow ducked back into the cabin. "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" Clara screamed at Gideon over the gunfire. "Are you?" He shot back, but there was something like awe in his eyes. "That was a hell of a shot." "I missed." "You saved my life, same difference." More shots from the cabin, but they were erratic now, desperate. Crow was trapped, and he knew it. Hayes was advancing from one side, his deputies from the others. The cabin that had been Gideon's fortress had become Crow's prison. "Crow," Hayes bellowed, "come out with your hands up. You're surrounded. There's no way out." "There's always a way out." Crow's voice was ragged now, unhinged. "I'm not going to hang for protecting what's mine." "You're not protecting anything. You're just a coward who preys on the weak and hides behind money and power." Gideon's voice carried across the clearing, strong, despite the smoke damage. "My brother was twice the man you'll ever be, and he died standing up for what was right. What have you ever stood for except your own greed?" Silence from the cabin. Then Crow appeared in the doorway, and Clara's heart lurched. He wasn't holding a rifle anymore. He was holding a torch, and behind him she could see flames starting to spread through the cabin's interior. He'd set fire to the whole thing. "If I can't have what's mine, then neither can you," Crow shouted. He threw the torch back inside and raised his hands like he was surrendering. But Clara saw his other hand moving toward his belt, saw the pistol holstered there. "He's going for a gun!" she screamed. Everything happened at once. Crow drew the pistol. Hayes and his deputies opened fire. Gideon lunged in front of Clara, shielding her with his body, and Crow got off one shot before the bullets hit him. The rancher jerked backward, his pistol falling into the snow. He staggered, caught himself against the doorframe, then slowly crumpled. Behind him, the cabin was fully engulfed now, flames roaring through the windows and licking at the roof. Hayes approached carefully, his rifle still trained on Crow. The other deputies fanned out, securing the area. Claire and Gideon stayed where they were, clutching each other, both of them shaking. "He's alive!" Hayes called out. "Barely." "Morrison, get the medical kit." They watched as the deputies worked to stabilize Crow, watched as the cabin that had been their home burned to the ground. 12 years of Gideon's life, 6 weeks of their marriage, all of it consumed by flames. Claire felt tears on her cheeks, but couldn't tell if they were from smoke or grief or relief that it was over. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Gideon. "You're home. It's just wood and nails." His voice was rough, but his arms were steady around her. "You're safe. That's all that matters." Hayes walked over to them, his face grim. "Crow's not going to make it. Lung shot. He's got maybe an hour if he's lucky. But he's conscious, and he's asking for you, Vale." Gideon's whole body went rigid. "Why?" "Don't know. But if you want to hear what he has to say, now's your chance. Might be the only closure you get." Clara felt Gideon struggling with the decision. Part of him wanted to refuse, to let Crow die without giving him any satisfaction. But another part, the part that had carried 12 years of grief and rage, needed to face the man who'd killed his brother one last time. "I'll go," Gideon said finally. He looked at Clara. "You don't have to come." "Yes, I do." She took his hand. "Partners, remember?" They walked together to where Crow lay in the snow, blood spreading dark around him. The man who'd terrorized the territory for years looked small now, diminished by pain and approaching death. His cold blue eyes tracked their approach. "Vale," he rasped. "Come to gloat?" "No." Gideon knelt in the snow beside him. "I came because you asked, but I don't have anything to say to you." "That's fine. I've got plenty to say." Crow coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Your brother, Daniel. You want to know why I killed him?" "I know why. He was going to expose you." "No." Crow's laugh turned into a wet cough. "I didn't give a damn about his evidence. I could have bought off anyone who mattered. I killed him because he reminded me of what I used to be. Young, idealistic, believing the world could be fair." His eyes fixed on Gideon. "I killed him because seeing him was like looking at my own failure, at the man I could have been if I'd made different choices." Gideon's jaw worked. Clara could feel him trembling, could feel the rage and grief radiating off him in waves. "That's not a reason," Gideon said hoarsely. "That's just spite. That's all it ever was. Spite and fear, and the desperate need to prove I was right, to choose power over decency." Crow's breathing was getting shallower. "You want to know the worst part? I can't even remember. Most of the people I've hurt, their faces are all blurred together. But Daniel, I remember him. Every detail, because he was the only one who looked at me and saw what I'd become. And he wasn't afraid, just disappointed." A single tear tracked down Crow's weathered cheek. "I've spent 12 years trying to forget that look, hurt dozens of people, ruined countless lives, all to prove to myself that power was worth it, that I made the right choice." He coughed again, weaker now. "But lying here, dying, I finally understand. Your brother won. He died standing up for what was right, and I'm going to die, having stood for nothing except my own emptiness." Gideon stared at him, and Clara watched as something shifted in her husband's face. The rage that had driven him for 12 years, the need for revenge that had consumed him. She could see it draining away, replaced by something more complicated. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Recognition that Crow wasn't a monster, just a man who'd made terrible choices and spent his life doubling down on them rather than admit he was wrong. "I hope," Gideon said quietly, "that wherever you go next, you finally find the courage you spent your life running from." Crow's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across his face. Then he smiled, just barely. "Your brother would have said something like that." His breathing rattled. "He was better than both of us, Imbas." The light faded from his eyes. His chest rose once more, then stilled. Silas Crow, the man who'd terrorized the territory for decades, died in the snow with the smell of burning wood in the air, and the man he'd wronged most watching without hatred. Hayes checked for a pulse, then shook his head. "He's gone." Gideon stood slowly, Clara rising with him. They turned away from Crow's body and looked at what remained of their cabin. The fire was burning itself out now, nothing left to consume but memories and ash. The roof had collapsed completely, the walls were crumbling. By morning, there'd be nothing but a stone chimney and blackened timber. "What now?" Clara asked quietly. "Now?" Gideon pulled her close, resting his chin on her head. "Now we figure out what comes after revenge. I've been chasing Crow's shadow for 12 years. I don't know who I am without that chase. You're my husband. You're the man who taught me to defend myself. You're someone who chooses to build instead of destroy." Clara looked up at him. "You're whoever you decide to be now that you're not carrying all that rage." Gideon's eyes were wet. "I don't know how to do that." "Then we'll figure it out together, one day at a time." Hayes cleared his throat. "I hate to interrupt, but we need to head back down before we lose the light completely. You two can ride double with my deputies. We'll send someone back tomorrow to deal with Crow's body and assess what can be salvaged from the cabin." The ride back down the mountain was slow and somber. Clara rode with Gideon on Deputy Morrison's horse pressed against his chest, feeling his heartbeat gradually slow from the adrenaline spike. Around them, the forest was peaceful, the violence of the last few hours already being absorbed back into the mountain's ancient quiet. Nature didn't care about human conflicts. It just continued, patient and enduring. By the time they reached Black Hollow, full darkness had fallen. But the town was awake, every window lit. People gathered in the streets waiting for news. When they saw the marshal's group returning with Clara and Gideon, but without Crow, a murmur swept through the crowd. Hayes dismounted and addressed them. "Silas Crow is dead. He resisted arrest, set fires, and fired on federal officers. He died from wounds sustained in the conflict. His reign over this territory is finished." The silence that followed was profound. Then someone in the crowd, Clara couldn't see who, started clapping. It was slow at first, hesitant, like they couldn't quite believe it was safe to celebrate. But then others joined in, and within moments the entire street was applauding, not for violence or death, but for the end of fear. Clara saw her father in the crowd, tears streaming down his face, his hands pressed together like he was praying. She felt a complicated knot of emotions. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the beginning of understanding. He'd been broken by his own failures, and in his brokenness he'd nearly broken her. But she'd survived. She'd become someone stronger than fear. Mrs. Patterson pushed through the crowd and embraced Clara. "Thank the stars you're safe, both of you. Come, I've got hot food and clean rooms waiting." They followed her to the boarding house, too exhausted to do anything but accept help. Someone brought them soup and bread. Someone else brought blankets. People kept stopping by to thank them, to express relief, to share their own stories of how Crow had hurt them. Each story was a small weight lifted, a piece of collective trauma finally finding voice. It was close to midnight when they were finally alone in their room. Clara helped Gideon out of his smoke-damaged clothes and examined him for injuries. He had burns on his hands from rescuing Sheriff Porter, bruises on his ribs from diving for cover, and his lungs still rattled when he breathed. But he was alive. They both were. "We need to talk about what comes next," Gideon said as Clara bandaged his hands. "The cabin's gone. We could rebuild, but it'll take months and winter's setting in hard. Where else would we go? Anywhere. We're not tied to Black Hollow. We could head to Silver Creek or further west or even back east if you wanted. Start completely fresh somewhere nobody knows us." Clara considered that. The idea of leaving had appeal. Clean slate, no memories of violence or fear following them. But something in her resisted. Would running away make us free? Or would we just be carrying everything with us in a different location? Gideon was quiet for a moment. You're right, geography doesn't heal wounds. We'd still be us, just somewhere else. So maybe we stay, at least for now. We have a legal marriage, a home we could rebuild, friends here like Ben Tucker and Marshall Hayes. That's more than most people start with. Clara finished wrapping his hands and sat back. Besides, I'm tired of running. I did that my whole life. Running from my father's failures, running from being seen, running from everything hard. I don't want to run anymore. Even though staying means rebuilding from ashes, especially because of that. Clara took his bandaged hands in hers carefully. Everything good I have came from something burning down first. My old life had to burn before I could have this one. The cabin burned, but we're still here. Maybe that's the lesson, that we're not our buildings or our circumstances. We're what we choose to be when everything else is stripped away. Gideon pulled her close, mindful of his injuries. How did you get so wise? I'm not wise. I'm just tired of being afraid. She rested her head against his chest. And I know what I want now. I want a life with you. I want to rebuild that cabin and make it ours instead of just yours. I want to wake up every morning and choose you again. I want to prove that love without chains is possible. It won't be easy. People will talk. Some will say you're damaged goods, married to a killer, living in sin even though we're legally bound. Let them talk. They talked before and I survived. I'll survive it again. Clara looked up at him. The only opinion that matters to me is yours, and mine. Everyone else can think whatever they want. Gideon kissed her then, soft and reverent, like she was something precious he still couldn't quite believe was his. I love you. I don't say it enough, but I do. More than I knew I could still love anything. I know. You show it every day. Clara smiled. Now sleep. We can figure out the details of our life tomorrow. Tonight, we just rest. They lay down together in that narrow boarding house bed, wrapped around each other like they were each other's anchor. Outside, Black Hollow was celebrating the end of an era. Inside, Clara and Gideon were beginning a new one. The next weeks passed in a strange blur of testimony and legal proceedings and endless questions from territorial officials who wanted every detail of Crow's crimes documented. Clara and Gideon gave their statements, signed papers, answered the same questions a dozen different ways. Crow's men talked eagerly now that their boss was dead, each one trying to minimize their own involvement while confirming years of illegal activities. The web of corruption Crow had woven was so extensive it took 3 federal investigators to untangle it all. In the end, 7 additional men were charged with crimes ranging from bribery to murder. 5 judges resigned in disgrace. The territorial governor launched a formal inquiry into law enforcement across 3 counties. And everywhere Clara and Gideon went, people treated them differently now. Not with pity or fear, but with something like respect. They'd stood up to the most powerful man in the territory and survived. That meant something. Clara's father left town quietly one morning without saying goodbye. Mrs. Patterson told her he'd gone east to his brother's farm in Missouri to try starting over. Clara felt a complicated mix of relief and sorrow. She hoped he'd find sobriety and peace. She hoped he'd become someone his daughter could have been proud of. But she didn't need to watch that transformation to feel complete. She'd said what needed saying. The rest was his journey to walk alone. Marshall Hayes offered Gideon a job as a deputy marshal, saying the territory needed men who couldn't be bought and knew the mountains. Gideon considered it seriously before declining. He'd spent 12 years pursuing justice through violence. He wanted to try building something instead of destroying things now. By the time spring started breaking winter's grip on the mountains, they'd made their decision. They'd rebuild the cabin, but not alone. Ben Tucker helped with the timber work. Several men from Black Hollow volunteered labor, partly out of genuine gratitude, and partly because turning down a request from the couple who'd ended Crow's reign felt unwise. Even Mrs. Patterson rode up to supervise and make sure the cabin had proper women's quarters, by which she meant shelves in the kitchen and a separate bathing area. The new cabin was larger than the old one, with a proper bedroom on the main floor and the loft converted to storage. It had bigger windows that let in more light, and a porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs. Gideon built everything with care, and Clara worked beside him, learning carpentry and masonry and all the practical skills that turned a house into a home. On the first night they slept in the finished cabin, Clara stood on the porch and looked out at the mountains. The view was the same, but everything else was different. She was different. The frightened girl who'd walked down that church aisle 7 months ago no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who knew how to defend herself, how to love without surrender, how to choose her own path. Gideon came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking?" "That I'm grateful for all of it. Even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts. They taught me who I could be when I stopped trying to be what everyone else wanted." "Any regrets?" Clara turned in his arms and smiled. "Only that we didn't have more time. 7 months isn't long enough to build a life with someone. Then we'll take the next 7 months. And the 7 after that. And we'll keep taking them until we run out of time or mountains or reasons to stay." "That sounds perfect." They went inside, into their home, into the life they'd built from ashes and determination. And as spring turned the mountains green and the fear that had gripped Black Hollow for years finally released its hold, stories began spreading across the territory. Stories about a feared mountain man who'd outsmarted a tyrant without becoming one himself. Stories about a young woman who'd learned to fight instead of submit. Stories about love that asked for partnership instead of ownership. The legends people told varied depending on who was doing the telling. Some made Gideon into a hero. Some made Clara into a warrior. Some made them both into saints who'd sacrificed everything for justice. But the people who actually knew them understood the truth was simpler and more radical than legend allowed. They were just two damaged people who'd chosen to stand together instead of falling apart separately. They'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That love didn't require perfection, just persistent choice. That the most dangerous thing you could do to tyrants wasn't kill them, but refuse to become them. And on quiet evenings, when Clara and Gideon sat on their porch watching the sun paint the mountains gold, they'd remember how close they'd come to losing everything. They'd remember the fire and the fear and the moment they'd each decided that surviving together was worth more than safety alone. Black Hollow never forgot them. Years later, when people gathered around fires and told stories about the territory's wildest days, the tale of Clara and Gideon Vale was always among them. The details shifted and grew, as stories do, but the heart remained true. In a time when women were treated as property and violence was the only language power understood, two people proved that another way was possible. They chose each other freely. They fought for their freedom without taking others. They showed that the strongest bonds were built on respect, not control. And somewhere up in those mountains, in a cabin rebuilt from ashes, they made a life that proved love without chains wasn't just possible. It was the only kind worth having,